The wind moves first. Not loud, not dramatic, just enough to remind the city that it is still breathing, even if no one else is. Grass pushes through cracks in the motorway. Long, pale, uncut for decades, a red double-decker bus leans sideways, frozen mid-journey, its windows clouded with dust and time. London stands here like a memory that refuses to disappear. 28 years. That's how long it's been since the world ended. Not with fire, not with explosions, but with screaming, a single infection, a single moment of panic, and then the running. The camera drifts through empty streets where footsteps once echoed. Now there's only the sound of wind brushing plastic bags against rusted railings. A torn poster flaps against a wall, its edges eaten away by rain and sun. The word evacuation is still readable. Everything else is gone. Inside a narrow apartment, a man wakes. His name is Evan. He doesn't wake suddenly. No gasp, no panic, just eyes opening slowly, the way someone does when sleep is lighter than memory. The room smells of damp concrete and old smoke. Evan sits up on a mattress laid directly on the floor. His movements are practiced. Quiet. Survival has rhythm. Noise gets you killed. He reaches for a watch on his wrist. The glass is cracked. The hands still move. Time survived longer than people. Evan checks the window first. Always the window. He pulls the cloth aside just enough to look out. Nothing moves. That's worse than danger. He exhales through his nose. Slow. Controlled. Then he begins the routine. Knife. Bag. Water. Canteen. Half full. Radio. Its antenna bent like a broken finger. 28 years ago, Evan was a child hiding under a table while the world outside burned itself alive. Now, he is 40-something, his hair touched with gray, his eyes permanently scanning, measuring distance, exits, angles. He doesn't remember normal life clearly anymore, but his body does. The radio crackles when he turns it on. Static first, always static, then a voice. Repeat, anyone receiving, north sector, movement confirmed. Evan freezes. The sound crawls into the room like a living thing. Human, unfiltered, real. He turns the dial carefully, afraid of losing it. Not infected, I repeat, not infected. I repeat, not infected. The signal fades. Silence slams back into place. The signal fades. Silence slams back into place. Evan doesn't move for a long moment. Hope is dangerous. Hope makes people reckless. Outside, clouds roll slowly across a pale sky. The kind of sky that looks peaceful enough to lie. He packs anyway. The stairwell smells like mold and rust. His boots avoid loose steps by instinct. Every floor he passes tells the same story. Doors broken inward, furniture overturned, lives interrupted mid-moment. Furniture overturned, lives interrupted mid-moment. On the ground level, daylight spills through a collapsed wall. Evan steps out into the open street. That's when he hears it. Not a scream. Not yet. A wet, dragging sound. Somewhere nearby. Then a breath that doesn't sound human anymore. Evan turns slowly. Down the street, half hidden behind a burned-out car, something twitches. A shape. A body. Skin stretched tight. Veins. Dark. Eyes wide and wrong. Infected, it lifts its head and smells him. The scream explodes out of its throat like a weapon. Evan runs. His boots hit asphalt hard. Too loud. The infected crashes into motion behind him, all speed and rage, limbs pumping with inhuman force. Left turn. Vault over a fallen barrier. Glass shatters underfoot. Another scream answers the first. Then another scream answers the first. Then another. The city wakes. Evan dives through a narrow doorway, slams his shoulder against the door, bolts it. Wood splinters instantly, hands pound, teeth snap through cracks. He doesn't wait. Through the back, over a fence, down into an alley filled with stagnant water and rot. His lungs burn. His heart slams like it wants out. He climbs, scrapes skin, keeps moving. Finally, silence. He crouches behind a pile of rubble, chest heaving, sweat cold against his spine. The infected don't search. They hunt until they lose. Then they move on. Evan wipes blood from his arm. Not deep, still dangerous. He looks back toward the direction of the radio signal. North sector. No one sane goes north anymore. The old quarantine zones collapsed there first. Too many bodies. Too much history. Evan closes his eyes. 28 years ago, his father told him, if the world breaks, survive long enough to see what grows after. Evan opens his eyes again. The city hasn't grown kindness, but something is still talking on the radio. He stands, adjusts his pack, and starts walking north. Behind him, the wind carries distant screams through empty streets. Ahead of him, something new waits. North doesn't announce itself. It just feels wrong. The streets narrow as Evan moves forward, buildings leaning closer together like they're sharing secrets. The air smells different here. Sharper. Metallic. Old blood never really leaves a place. It just fades into the bricks. He keeps his steps uneven. No rhythm. Rhythm gets followed. Every block tells a story that ends the same way. Cars abandoned mid-turn, doors ripped from hinges, black scorch marks climbing walls like burned shadows of people who didn't escape fast enough. The radio stays silent. That bothers him more than screams. Evan slips into an underground pedestrian tunnel. Darkness swallows him immediately. The temperature drops. His breath fogs. His breath fogs. His breath fogs. Halfway through, he stops. Someone has been here recently. Not infected. People. Boot prints and dust. Fresh enough to still have edges. A rope tied around a broken pipe. New knots. Tight. Evan touches the rope. Still rough. Fibers not yet softened by time. A sound echoes ahead. Footsteps. He pulls back into the shadows, knife sliding into his palm like it belongs there. His heartbeat slows. Focus narrows. A figure emerges from the far end of the tunnel. Human shape. Careful movement. Weapon held low. Then a voice cuts through the dark. Easy. If you were infected, you'd already be screaming. The figure steps into a beam of light filtering through a crack in the ceiling. A woman. Early 30s. Dark hair tied back tight. A scar runs from her jaw to her ear, pale against weathered skin. Her rifle looks maintained. Loved. Evan doesn't lower the knife. Radio signal, she says. You heard it. Not a question. Maybe, Evan replies. She studies him. Not his face, his hands, his posture. Survivor reading survivor. Name's Lena, she says. I'm not here to rob you. If I wanted you dead, you'd be quieter right now. Evan exhales once, lowers the knife. Evan! They don't shake hands. No one does anymore. They walk together, not side by side. Angled. Space for reaction. Trust comes later. Sometimes never. You heading north for hope or guilt? Lena asks. Evan doesn't answer immediately. The tunnel opens back into daylight. Habit, he finally says. She almost smiles. They reach a rooftop access point overlooking what used to be a transit hub. Below them, bodies. Old ones, new ones. Infected tangled together like they died trying to climb over each other. Lena crouches. Scans. Signal came from a relay station 3 kilometers north, she says. Military built. Pre-collapse. If it's active, someone's maintaining it. Or broadcasting on loop, Evan says. Loop wouldn't adjust frequency. She taps the side of her head. This one did. That lands. They move fast after that. The city resists them. A collapsed bridge forces a detour through flooded basements. Cold water seeps into Evan's boots, numbing his toes. A pack of infected chase them across an open square, their screams bouncing between buildings like sirens. Lena drops one with a clean shot. Evan takes another with the knife. Too close. Too personal. Blood sprays warm. The smell lingers. By the time they reach the relay station, dusk is bleeding into night. The building stands alone, concrete and steel, wrapped in barbed wire. Lights glow inside. Real lights. Evan feels something tighten in his chest. Not hope. Fear shaped like hope. They circle the perimeter. Something's wrong, Lena whispers. Too quiet. Too clean. The front gate opens. A man steps out. Clean clothes. Shaved face. Calm eyes. Behind him, more people appear. Armed. Organized. Welcome, the man says. You're late. Am. Organized. Welcome, the man says. You're late. The man smiles like he's practiced it. We've been broadcasting for days, he continues. You survived the approach. That means you're useful. Useful for what? Lena asks. The man's gaze shifts to Evan. To build something new, he says, whether you want to or not. The gates close behind them. Metal slams metal. Evan realizes something too late. This signal wasn't a rescue call. It was bait. And now they've crossed a line the city won't let them uncross. Inside the compound, generators hum, voices echo, rules wait to be learned the hard way. Evan steps forward anyway, because turning back was never really an option. The gate seals with a final sound, not loud, permanent. Inside the compound, order replaces chaos so completely it feels unreal. Floodlights cut clean cones through the dusk. Walkways are swept. Blood is absent. That absence is its own warning. Evan's eyes move constantly, counting exits, measuring distance between guards. 8 visible weapons, maybe more hidden. Lena walks with her shoulders loose, but her fingers never leave the rifle strap. Predators recognize cages faster than prey. The man who greeted them walks ahead, hands behind his back. "My name is Harris," he says. "You can think of me as coordination, not leadership. Leadership implies choice." They pass a line of people unloading crates from a truck. Thin, strong, quiet, no one looks up. That's worse than fear. Inside the main building, warmth hits Evan's skin. Real heat. Generators hum below the floor, steady as a heartbeat. Harris gestures to a long table covered in maps. Hand-drawn, updated, detailed. "This is what the world looks like now," Harris says. "Not the fantasy people carry, the functional version." Evan studies the map. Marked routes, patrol zones, red circles labeled LOAS, green zones labeled II yield. "You run farms," Evan asks. "Facilities," Harris corrects. "Farms sound hopeful." Lena leans closer to a map section marked North, Quarantine. Level 3. "That area was burned," she says. "Nothing survives there." Harris nods. Nothing survived alone. That's when Evan hears it. Children. Faint. Somewhere deeper in the building. Laughter, muffled by walls. The sound punches straight through him. Lemmel hears it too. Her jaw tightens. Harris watches their reaction carefully. "We don't recruit infected," he says. "We don't waste resources on the weak. And we don't let the old world decide who deserves to live." "What do you let decide?" Evan asks. Harris smiles again. "Output. They're shown sleeping quarters, bunk beds, clean sheets, dinner, real food, protein, warm, people eat fast, efficient." No conversation. A woman at the end of the table meets Evan's eyes for half a second, just long enough to communicate something without words. Don't speak. Later, lights dim on a schedule. Guards change shifts with precision. Evan lies on the bunk, staring at the ceiling. The hum of generators vibrates through the frame. This place didn't grow naturally. It was built. And built things can be unbuilt. A scream cuts through the night. Short, sharp, human. Then silence. Evan sits up. So does Lena. No one else moves. Morning comes without ceremony. Harris waits for them by the maps again. "You both have skills," he says. "We don't waste skills." He slides 2 items across the table. A radio transmitter. A map marked with a route deep into contaminated territory. "There's a settlement broadcasting unauthorized signals," Harris continues. "They interfere with ours. We need confirmation." "You want us to scout," Lena says. "Recover," Harris corrects. "If possible. And if not?" Evan asks. Harris doesn't hesitate. "Erase." The word lands heavy. Lena's voice drops. "Those could be families." Harris shrugs. "Everything is a family until it's competition." Evan looks at the map. The route passes through zones even infected packs avoid. "You're sending us because you think we'll survive," Evan says. Harris nods. "And because if you don't go, we'll send someone you care about instead." That's when Evan understands. This place isn't a refuge. It's a machine. And people are parts. Outside the compound walls, the wind carries distant screams again. Inside, silence is enforced. Evan folds the map. Lena meets his eyes. "This mission isn't about obedience. It's about learning how this machine works, so it can be broken." They leave at first light. The gates open, then close behind them. And somewhere in the distance, the radio crackles again. Not from Harris. From someone else. From someone else. From! The road swallows sound. Once Evan and Lena pass beyond the compound's outer perimeter, the world shifts its weight. Air thickens. Light dulls. Concrete gives way to broken asphalt stitched together by weeds sharp enough to cut skin. No birds, no insects. Life avoids this place on purpose. They move fast, but not careless. Lena leads. Evan covers the rear. Years of surviving separately snapping into shared rhythm without discussion. The map Harris gave them feels wrong in Evan's hands. Too clean, too intentional. Notice how this route curves? Lena murmurs without looking back. Evan sees it now. The path avoids open areas, channels them through choke points. He's hurting us, Evan says. Yeah, Lena replies. Question is, why? They descend into an underground service corridor. The smell hits immediately stagnant water, rust, decay layered so deep it feels physical. Their flashlights cut narrow tunnels through the dark. Halfway in, Evan hears breathing. Not infected, too controlled. He raises a fist. Lena stops instantly. Footsteps echo from ahead. Then a voice. Young! Female! Don't shoot! A girl steps into the beam of light. No weapon! Filthy jacket 2 sizes too big. Her eyes are sharp in a face still shaped like childhood. Behind her, 2 others appear. Teenagers. Thin. Armed with scavenged blades and fear. We heard the broadcast, the girl says. The other one. Lena lowers her rifle slightly. You're the unauthorized signal. The girl nods. They call us that. Evan watches her carefully. No tremor. No panic. Survivor born into ruin. How many of you? Evan asks. Enough, she says. Not many. They follow the kids deeper into the tunnels. Candles line the walls, symbols scratched into concrete circles broken by lines, repeated again and again. What do they mean? Lena asks. Warning, the girl says. And memory. The settlement is hidden beneath an old rail station. Tents, fires, water collection systems built from scrap and stubborn intelligence. People look up as Evan and Lena enter. Faces hard, curious. Afraid, not obedient. An older woman approaches, gray hair braided tight, eyes that have seen too much and survived anyway. You came from the tower, she says. Yes, Evan replies. Her jaw tightens. Then you should leave. We can't, Lena says. They sent us to erase you. Silence spreads like spilled oil. The woman studies Evan's face, then Lena's. They always do, she says softly. Because we remind people of what existed before control. She gestures to the children. They don't like that. Evan feels it click. Harris isn't protecting humanity, he's curating it. A radio crackles nearby. A child's voice speaks into it. Calm, clear. Unauthorized signal remains active, the voice says. If you're out there, you're not alone. Evan closes his eyes. This is what Harris fears. Not infection, not chaos, choice. Gunfire erupts above them. Dust rains down. Screams echo through tunnels. They followed you, someone yells. Lena spins toward Evan. We have to move. Now. Evan grabs the radio transmitter Harris gave them, looks at it, then smashes it against the concrete. The crack echoes loud and final. He meets Lena's eyes. Point of no return, he says. She nods once. Above them, boots pound. Orders barked with confidence. Below them, people scramble. Not in panic, but purpose. The old woman grips Evan's arm. You break their machine, she says. Or it breaks all of us. Evan looks around at the faces. Children who never saw the old world but still carry its echo. He shoulders his pack. Then let's start breaking. The lights flicker. Everything moves at once. Boots thunder overhead. Metal doors slam. Voices cut through the tunnels, sharp with authority and certainty. Harris's people don't shout in panic. They shout in sequence. That's how Evan knows how dangerous they are. South corridor! Lock it! Thermal sweep active! Non-lethal on civilians! Lethal on resistance! The words slide through the underground like poison. Lena pulls Evan behind a concrete pillar as a squad rushes past the tunnel mouth above them. Flashlights slice down through grates, beams stabbing blindly. They came prepared, she whispers. Too prepared. The settlement responds instantly, not screaming, not chaos. Movement, tents collapse into bundles, fires are smothered, children disappear into side passages like they practiced this their whole lives. Because they have. Evan follows the old woman. Mara, he's learned, through a narrow service shaft barely wide enough to crawl. How many times? Evan asks between breaths. Mara doesn't slow. Enough to stop counting. A stun blast crackles behind them. Someone cries out, "Not dead! Taken!" That's worse. They emerge into a larger chamber filled with old train cars stacked like barricades. People take positions, homemade weapons raised, faces set. Lena climbs onto a rusted platform, scanning angles. "This is where they push," she says. "They'll want prisoners." A man next to Evan tightens his grip on a metal spear. "Not this time," he mutters. The first wave hits. Flashbangs explode, white light ripping vision apart. Evan stumbles, ears screaming. Then gunfire. Precise. Controlled. Harris's people move like a single organism. Evan rolls behind cover as bullets tear through scrap metal inches from his head. He feels the impacts vibrate through his bones. Lena fires back. One shot, one body down. But more replace it instantly. This isn't a battle. It's a correction. Evan spots something near the rear. An equipment crate marked with the same symbol as the relay station. Power distribution. He realizes Harris isn't here just to erase the signal. He's here to cut the route. "Lena!" Evan shouts. "They're targeting infrastructure." She looks, sees it, swears. A child runs across the open space carrying a battery pack. Too slow. A rifle cracks. Evan moves without thinking. He tackles the child mid-stride. The shot hits where they were a second ago. Concrete explodes. The child sobs once, then clamps their mouth shut. "Go," Evan says. "Now." The kid runs. Something breaks inside Evan's chest. Not fear. Anger. Finally given permission, he charges. Close quarters now. Knife against armor. Breath against breath. He takes one down. Then another. The world narrows to movement and impact and blood on his hands that isn't infected. Lena covers him, relentless. Mara shouts orders. "Routes open! Routes close!" The settlement bends but doesn't break. Then the ground shakes. A deep mechanical hum rises from below. Evan feels it through his boots. "They're powering something up," Lena yells. Harris steps into view across the chamber, untouched. Calm. A handheld mic in his grip. "This is your final chance," his voice booms through speakers. "Lay down your weapons! We preserve what submits!" Evan meets his gaze across the chaos. "You don't preserve!" Evan shouts back. "You harvest!" Harris tilts his head, almost curious. "History will disagree!" The hum grows louder. Lights flicker. The tunnels tremble. Mara grabs Evan's arm, eyes wide. "He's going to flood the lower levels," she says. "Flush us out!" Water begins pouring from ceiling vents. Cold. Fast. Panic finally breaks through. People scramble upward. Slippery ground. Children lifted, passed hand to hand. Lena locks eyes with Evan. "We can't win this here," she says. Evan looks at the rising water, the collapsing tunnels, then at Harris, already turning away. "No," Evan replies, "but we can make him bleed." Evan spots a maintenance shaft marked on the map he memorized earlier. Direct line to the generator core. A suicide route. He takes a breath. "I'll go," he says. Lena grabs his collar. "You won't make it out!" Evan holds her gaze. "I know." For a moment, the world holds still between them. Then Lena nods. "Make it count." Evan runs. Behind him, water roars. Ahead of him, the machine's heart waits. And this time, he's not running to survive. He's running to end something. The maintenance shaft breathes heat. Evan drops into it, feet first, slamming the hatch shut above him just as water surges past the opening. The sound changes immediately. Muffled chaos replaced by a low, steady roar. The machine's voice. The shaft is narrow, metal walls slick with condensation. Every rung burns his palms. Every breath tastes like oil and electricity. He climbs down fast, too fast. Skin tears. Blood slicks metal. Doesn't matter. Below him, the hum deepens. Not louder, closer. Memory bleeds in uninvited. A kitchen table. His mother shouting for him to run. The sound of glass breaking somewhere behind her. Evan shakes it away. Now is now. He drops the final 3 meters hard, knees screaming as he hits concrete. The generator room opens around him like a cathedral built for noise. Turbines spin behind reinforced glass. Cables as thick as his torso pulse with light. Control panels blink in disciplined rows. Order made physical. 2 guards stand at the far end. They don't expect anyone from this direction. That mistake cost them everything. Evan moves before thought finishes forming. Knife out. 3 steps. 1 scream cut short. The second guard turns just in time to see Evan's face. Recognition flashes. Human, not infected. And then the knife finds his throat. Silence crashes down. Evan leans against the console, chest heaving. Blood drips onto the floor, mixing with condensation. He looks at the controls. No labels meant for civilians. Military logic. Fail-safes layered on fail-safes. Harris built this system to survive rebellion. Evan pulls the map from memory. Power flows from the core. Emergency lockdown seals upper levels. If he cuts it wrong, everyone dies. Above him, faintly, he hears it. Children coughing, people screaming as water rises. Time fractures. Evan grips the console, hands shaking. This is the moment. Not a fight. Not a chase. A choice. A choice. A choice. A choice. He reroutes power instead of killing it. Hands flying. Muscle memory from a life before collapse. College classes he never finished, skills he never thought would matter. Lights flicker. The hum stutters. Then alarms erupt. Red floods the room. Above, the water stops rising. Somewhere far overhead, Harris feels it. Evan knows because the system fights back. Failsafe doors slam shut. A countdown begins. Core, Brechen, 02. Evan laughs once, short, almost surprised. Good, he mutters. Footsteps thunder outside the generator room. Harris enters alone, unarmed. Of course. He surveys the damage calmly, like a man inspecting a cracked tool. You don't understand what you've done, Harris says. Evan turns slowly. I understand perfectly. Harris steps closer, eyes steady. You've doomed stability. People need order. They beg for it. No, Evan replies. They're just afraid of silence. Harris studies him, then looks at the countdown. Come with me, he says. We can still reset this. You have value. Evan shakes his head. For the first time in a long time, he says, I know exactly what I'm worth. The countdown hits Duro 1030. Harris's calm finally fractures. You'll kill yourself, he snaps. Evan smiles faintly. Yeah! He slams the final override. Emergency doors unlock across the facility. Signals die. The relay tower goes dark. Somewhere underground, Lena feels the air change. Routes open. Gates fail. The machine loses its grip. Harris lunges, but it's too late. Evan shoves him back through the doorway and seals it. The last thing Evan hears is Harris shouting his name. The generator's pitch rises to a scream. Evan leans against the console, breathing slow. He thinks of the bus frozen on the street, the watch still ticking, the radio voice that wasn't supposed to exist. The explosion doesn't roar. It collapses. Light swallows the room. Morning doesn't arrive gently. It crawls over the ruins in pale gray layers, revealing what the night tried to hide. Smoke coils upward where the relay tower once stood. Concrete lies split open like bone. The city exhales. For the first time in decades, it isn't screaming. Lena stands at the edge of the underground exit, boots planted in wet ash. Her ears still ring, her hands still shake, but the water is gone. The tunnels breathe again. People emerge slowly, one by one. Children first, then the injured, then the ones who stayed behind to make sure no one was left. They look upward, searching for something familiar. The tower is gone. So is Harris. Mara steps beside Lena, her face streaked with soot and exhaustion. He did it, Mara says. Lena nods, unable to speak yet. They move through the wreckage together, past broken weapons, past abandoned uniforms stripped of insignia, past men who believed order could replace humanity. At the edge of the blast radius, Lena finds Evan's watch, cracked glass, hands still moving. Time survived him too. She closes her fingers around it, metal cold against her palm, and finally lets the grief hit. Not loud, not dramatic, just heavy. Days pass. The settlement doesn't celebrate. It rebuilds. Tunnels are cleared. New exits carved. The radio hums again, but differently now. No commands, no coordinates, just voices. I'm here. We're alive. You're not alone. The signal spreads, not strong, but honest. Fragile in the way real things are. Lena helps train patrols. Not soldiers. Watchers. Watch shell in the way real things are. People who protect without controlling. At night, she sits near the surface and listens to the city. Wind through broken streets. Distant infected cries. Still there, still dangerous, but quieter. One evening, a child asks her, "Was he brave?" Lena thinks of Evan running towards something he knew would end him, not because he wanted to die, but because he refused to let fear decide the future. "Yes," she says, "but that's not why he mattered." "Then why?" the child asks. Lena looks toward the north where the tower once stood. "Because he chose." Weeks later, Lena walks the same street Evan walked at the beginning. The bus still leans, the grass still grows, but now someone has cleared a path through it. She stops where the wind moves first, pulls the watch from her pocket. The second hand ticks. She sets it down on the pavement, right where the light hits strongest. A marker, not for the dead, for what comes after. The radio crackles softly at her side. Another voice answers back. Somewhere far away, someone hears it. And keeps going. The world didn't end when the infection came. It ended when people stopped choosing each other. Now, quietly, painfully, it begins again. Time stretches differently when the world has already ended once. 28 years later arrives carrying that weight, the memory of catastrophe no longer fresh, no longer shocking, but sedimented into daily existence. This isn't a story about outbreak panic or sudden collapse. It's about what happens after survival calcifies into routine, when fear becomes infrastructure, when the extraordinary horror of infection turns into something disturbingly ordinary. From its opening movements, the film makes a quiet but devastating emotional promise. This isn't about whether humanity survives. It's about whether survival is still the same thing as living. The premise alone signals that shift. 28 years is not an arbitrary number. It's long enough for an entire generation to be born into ruin and call it normal. Long enough for memory to distort, for original trauma to become myth, for the rules created in desperation to harden into ideology. The film understands something crucial about time and trauma. Wounds don't simply heal or stay open. They evolve. They calcify. They become invisible precisely because they're everywhere. The emotional hook isn't fear of infection. It's the quieter, more corrosive dread of inheritance. What do you pass down when the world you inherited was already broken? From the first act, the film positions the audience inside that question. There's no indulgence in nostalgic callbacks or shock-based horror beats designed to mimic the original outbreak. Instead, there's a sense of emotional fatigue baked into the atmosphere. The world isn't screaming anymore, it's sighing. Systems exist. Communities function. Violence has rules. Safety has protocols. And that's what unsettles most. The movie promises an exploration of how humanity adapts not just physically, but morally, when catastrophe becomes permanent, when emergency ethics quietly replace moral ones. Emotionally, the film offers something more unsettling than terror, recognition. It mirrors a psychological truth many viewers already live with, the feeling that crisis is no longer an interruption, but a baseline. The opening movements ask the audience to sit with an uncomfortable alignment. We understand these people. Their compromises make sense. Their numbness feels earned. The film doesn't demand immediate empathy through spectacle. It invites identification through familiarity. This is a horror story, built not on jump scares, but on the slow realization that we've already rehearsed this emotional posture in our own lives. The central promise here is not adrenaline, but confrontation. 28 years later signals early that it's interested in the cost of adaptation. Every rule that keeps people alive also trims something away. Spontaneity, trust, softness, hope. Survival becomes a negotiation with loss, and the film's emotional journey lies in watching characters navigate what they've decided is expendable. The tension isn't just external threat, it's internal erosion. At what point does protecting life begin to hollow it out? What makes the premise resonate beyond genre is how deliberately it refuses easy nostalgia. The earlier films asked urgent questions about rage, contagion, and collapse. This one asks a more disturbing follow-up. What if the rage won? Not explosively, but administratively. What if it settled into policy? The film promises to examine a society where fear has matured into governance, where emergency measures are no longer temporary, and where cruelty can be justified not by panic, but by precedent. That's a different kind of horror, one rooted in systems rather than monsters. The emotional promise extends inward as well. This is not a story that flatters its audience with moral superiority. Instead, it implicates. The film quietly asks, if you were raised here, if this was the only world you knew, what would you defend? What would you normalize? What lines would feel imaginary simply because you'd never seen them uncrossed? The premise insists that morality is not fixed. It's contextual, learned, reinforced. That idea alone reframes the genre from survival horror to ethical horror to ethical horror. There's also a subtle promise of intimacy embedded in the scale. While the world building implies decades of history, the emotional lens stays close to individual experience. The catastrophe is global, but the story is personal. That choice matters. It suggests the film isn't interested in grand solutions or sweeping declarations about humanity. Instead, it's concerned with small decisions made daily, the ones that don't feel dramatic enough to be judged until they accumulate into something irreversible. The emotional journey promised is cumulative dread, not cathartic release. Crucially, 28 years later positions hope as a dangerous concept rather than a guaranteed destination. The film doesn't sell redemption as inevitable. If anything, it treats hope like a volatile substance, something that can inspire change or invite destruction depending on who wields it and why. That ambiguity becomes part of the emotional contract with the audience. This isn't a film that reassures. It challenges viewers to sit with uncertainty, to accept that survival stories don't always arc toward light. Sometimes they spiral sideways. The premise also gestures toward generational fracture. Those who remember the world before carry one kind of grief. Those born after carry another, less articulate, but equally potent. The emotional promise lies in watching these perspectives collide. Memory versus myth. Experience versus indoctrination. The film suggests that conflict doesn't arise simply from infected versus uninfected, but from incompatible understandings of what the world is supposed to be. Horror emerges from that dissonance, from the realization that even without monsters, people can become unrecognizable to one another. By framing its story decades later, the film makes a bold claim. Endings are illusions. There is no after trauma, only continuation. The opening establishes that this is a narrative about consequences that refuse to expire. The emotional journey promised isn't about stopping an outbreak. It's about deciding what kind of society is allowed to exist in its shadow. That's a heavier, more adult proposition than genre convention usually allows, and the film leans into that weight without apology. Ultimately, the premise of 28 years later offers something rare in horror cinema, not escalation, but deepening. It doesn't ask how much worse things can get. It asks what happens when worse becomes normal, and whether normal is something worth preserving. The emotional promise is clear and unsettling. By the end, you won't just fear the infected. You'll fear the systems built to survive them, and more uncomfortably, you'll recognize pieces of those systems in yourself. The world of 28 years later is already formed by the time we meet its central figures, and that's what makes their psychology so quietly devastating. These characters are not reacting to catastrophe. They are products of it. Their inner lives have been shaped by rules they didn't choose, fears they didn't originate, and losses they inherited secondhand. The film understands that when trauma becomes environmental, it doesn't announce itself loudly. It embeds itself in posture, in instinct, in what feels reasonable. They have no personal memory of what was lost, only stories filtered through fear, propaganda, and survival logic. Psychologically, this creates a strange tension. They are expected to mourn something they never knew and to protect something they were never allowed to imagine differently. The film renders this as a subtle internal dissonance, an unease that never fully articulates itself but drives behavior. This character isn't reckless or rebellious by nature, they're restless. And restlessness, here, is the mind's response to living inside borrowed beliefs. Their protective mechanism is obedience masquerading as pragmatism. They follow rules, not because they believe in them deeply, but because rules offer relief from choice. Choice carries moral weight, and moral weight is dangerous in a world that punishes deviation brutally. The character's psychology reveals a survival strategy common in long-term crisis environments. Minimize internal conflict by outsourcing judgment to systems. If the rules decide, you don't have to. If the system is cruel, responsibility diffuses. The film doesn't condemn this instinct, it understands it. But it also traces the slow emotional cost of living without authorship over your own values. Desire and need sit in quiet opposition within this character. On the surface, their desire is safety, predictability, stability, survival within known boundaries. But what they need is something riskier, moral agency. The ability to decide not just how to live, but why. The film constructs this gap carefully, showing how moments of discomfort aren't triggered by danger, but by ambiguity. The character is most unsettled, not when infected loom, but when rules fail to provide clear answers. That's where psychology cracks open, revealing how deeply identity has been tied to compliance. Around them, other characters function as psychological mirrors rather than simple allies or antagonists. One figure embodies memory, someone who remembers the world before and carries that memory like a burden they can't set down. Psychologically, this character's wound is nostalgia hardened into grief. They are haunted not by what happened, but by what used to be possible. Their defense mechanism is idealization. The past becomes purer, kinder, more coherent with every retelling. This isn't presented as wisdom, it's shown as another form of survival, a way to keep loss from becoming meaningless. Through them, the film explores how memory can be both resistance and prison. Another character represents the opposite psychological adaptation, someone fully formed by the new world, emotionally fluent in its violence. There is no visible conflict in them, and that absence is what makes them unsettling. Their wound has been fully integrated into identity. They don't defend against trauma, they embody it. The film is careful not to make this character monstrous. Instead, it presents them as chillingly functional. This is what happens when survival logic faces no internal resistance, when empathy is reclassified as inefficiency. Their presence forces the protagonist to confront a terrifying possibility that adaptation can look like success. What's striking is how the film avoids framing any of these psychologies as incorrect. Each makes sense within its context. That's the point. 28 years later treats character not as moral alignment, but as accumulated coping strategy. Behavior is never random. It's always traceable to belief. And belief, here, is shaped by what the world has demanded in order to continue. The psychological realism lies in showing how even harmful traits, emotional numbness, moral rigidity, selective empathy emerge as solutions before they become problems. Transformation, when it begins, doesn't arrive as revelation. There is no single moment where the protagonist wakes up. Instead, the film shows growth as destabilization, small fractures in certainty, moments where rules protect survival but violate something unnamed inside. The psychological shift is gradual and uncomfortable. Each step toward agency increases risk, not just externally, but internally. To choose differently is to accept guilt, responsibility, and the possibility of being wrong, especially for someone raised inside systems that punish deviation as existential threat. Internal resistance becomes a central engine of tension. The protagonist knows on some level that something is wrong, but knowing doesn't immediately translate into action. The film respects that lag. Psychology doesn't change on command. Beliefs formed over decades don't evaporate because of one moral insight. Instead, the character oscillates, retreats, rationalizes. This back and forth feels painfully authentic. Growth isn't linear here, it's negotiated. Each step forward demands the surrender of psychological safety, and the film never minimizes that cost. What ties all these inner lives together is a shared, unspoken belief that the world cannot afford softness. Every character, in their own way, has accepted that premise. The difference lies in how they carry it. Some grieve it, some weaponize it, some bury it. The film's psychological depth comes from watching these strategies collide, revealing not good versus evil, but incompatible ways of surviving pain. And as those collisions intensify, it becomes clear that the true conflict isn't between people. It's between belief systems about what humanity is allowed to be after enduring the unendurable. Relationships in 28 years later are not sources of comfort, they're pressure points. This is a world where connection has been redefined as liability, where intimacy carries risk, not just of loss, but of moral exposure. The film understands something fundamental about human bonds. Under prolonged trauma, they stop being places we rest and become places we negotiate. Every relationship here is shaped less by affection than by function. Who keeps whom alive? Who compromises whom? Who reminds whom of something they're trying to forget? The central relationship is defined by asymmetry of belief rather than power. Two characters may share proximity, history, even loyalty, but they do not share the same internal rules. One believes survival justifies almost anything. The other suspects that survival without meaning is a slow extinction. What's compelling is how the film refuses to frame this as ideological debate. These differences surface through small, everyday decisions: who is worth saving, when to intervene, when to look away. Relationship dynamics become ethical battlegrounds precisely because they are intimate. You can ignore strangers. You can't ignore someone you care about without changing who you are. Trust operates differently here than in pre-collapse narratives. It's no longer about vulnerability. It's about predictability. Characters trust those who behave consistently within the system, not those who promise kindness. Reliability matters more than empathy. This creates relationships that feel stable but emotionally hollow, functional but brittle. The film shows how such bonds can last for years without ever deepening, because deepening would require questioning the assumptions that keep everyone alive. Emotional stasis masquerades as harmony. One of the most revealing dynamics is between characters who share blood but not worldview. Familial relationships here are haunted by unspoken grief and untransmitted values. Parents cannot teach what they themselves no longer practice. Children inherit rules without context. The film captures this generational disconnect with painful precision. Love exists, but it's filtered through fear. Protection replaces guidance. Silence replaces explanation. These relationships are heavy with intention and light on understanding, creating bonds that are sincere yet incomplete. Romantic connection, when it appears, is tentative and strangely cautious, not because of emotional immaturity, but because attachment creates leverage. To care deeply about someone is to give the world a hostage. The film doesn't romanticize this fear, it treats it as rational. Affection becomes something to manage rather than indulge. Moments of tenderness are brief, almost accidental, and that brevity makes them ache. The audience feels the cost of restraint because the film allows us to glimpse what's being withheld. Power dynamics within relationships are subtle but relentless. Those who are more emotionally numb often hold more control, not because they're stronger, but because they have less to lose. The film exposes a cruel paradox. Detachment becomes dominance. Characters who still feel deeply must negotiate their vulnerability constantly, measuring every expression of care against potential consequence. This imbalance doesn't always look like abuse. Sometimes it looks like protection. That ambiguity is where the film does its most unsettling work. Crucially, relationships also function as mirrors. Characters recognize parts of themselves in others they would rather deny. The obedient see their future in the ruthless. The nostalgic see their past in the naive. These reflections generate friction not through conflict, but through discomfort. The film shows how proximity to alternative ways of surviving threatens internal coherence. It's easier to dismiss an ideology than to sit across from someone who lives it daily. When relationships fracture, they don't explode. They erode. Distance grows quietly. Conversations shorten. Decisions are made alone. The film treats relational breakdown as a slow moral drift rather than a dramatic rupture. This choice reinforces its central insight. In long-term survival scenarios, damage accumulates invisibly. By the time loss becomes visible, it's already irreversible. That realization hits harder than any sudden betrayal. Yet, the film doesn't argue that connection is futile. Instead, it suggests that relationships are the only spaces where belief systems can be challenged without violence. Systems enforce conformity, but relationships expose contradiction. When someone you care about makes a different choice, you're forced to confront the limits of your own logic. That confrontation is dangerous, but it's also the only path toward transformation the film allows. The visual language of 28 years later doesn't announce itself loudly. It accumulates meaning through repetition and restraint. Symbols here are not decorative, they're behavioral. The film understands that when people live inside a system for decades, the most powerful metaphors are embedded in routine. What recurs isn't spectacle, but pattern. And those patterns quietly teach us what this world believes. One of the most persistent visual motifs is enclosure. Spaces are rarely open, even when outdoors. Fences bisect landscapes. Narrow corridors replace wide horizons. Architecture prioritizes control over comfort. This isn't just production design, it's psychology externalized. The characters live inside boundaries because their thinking has been trained to require them. Wide space equals danger. Containment equals safety. The film repeats this visual logic until it becomes instinctive for the viewer as well. By the time an open space finally appears, it doesn't feel liberating. It feels exposed. The image asks an unsettling question: when did freedom start to feel unsafe? Light functions as another evolving symbol. Early scenes are dominated by practical illumination, harsh, utilitarian, just enough to function. There is little softness, little warmth. Light exists to reveal threats, not beauty. As the story progresses, moments of natural light begin to intrude, not as hope, but as disruption. Sunlight exposes details characters have learned not to look at, faces without armor, damage without justification. The film uses light as moral visibility. Darkness hides compromise. Light demands reckoning. That's why characters often retreat from it instinctively, even when it offers physical safety. The infected themselves are treated less as monsters and more as environmental elements, weather rather than villains. Their visual presentation reinforces this shift. They appear not with dramatic emphasis, but with inevitability, often partially seen, sometimes ignored altogether. This choice reframes them symbolically as consequences rather than antagonists. They are the physical manifestation of an unresolved past, lingering at the edges of the present. The real visual horror lies not in their presence, but in how accustomed everyone has become to it. Objects gain meaning through repetition rather than focus. Protective gear, weapons, identification markers, these items recur so frequently that they fade into the background. And that fading is the point. When tools of violence become mundane, the film argues, violence has already been normalized. There's a chilling moment where an object associated with protection is used casually, without ceremony or emotion. No dramatic pause, no musical cue, just function. The image lands harder precisely because the film refuses to underline it. Symbolism here works through emotional absence. Mirrors and reflective surfaces appear sparingly, but deliberately. When characters encounter their reflections, it's rarely in moments of self-recognition, it's moments of dissonance. The reflection doesn't confirm identity, it unsettles it. The person looking back feels slightly misaligned, as if shaped by choices the character hasn't fully acknowledged. These images don't invite introspection, they provoke discomfort. The film suggests that in a world built on compromise, self-awareness is destabilizing. Movement through space also carries metaphorical weight. Ascending and descending recur subtly. Characters move downward, into bunkers, underground passages, enclosed shelters, during moments of perceived safety. They move upward or outward during moments of moral risk. This inversion challenges conventional symbolism. Safety is below. Danger is above. The film visually encodes the idea that ethical clarity exists in exposed spaces, while moral ambiguity thrives underground. Survival pushes people downward. Conscience pulls them up. Color is muted almost to the point of absence. When color does intrude, it's functional, warning signs, markers, signals. Emotional color is rare. This desaturation reflects a world that has stripped itself of excess feeling. When a warmer tone appears briefly, a piece of clothing, a shared space, it registers almost painfully, like a memory intruding into the present. The film doesn't linger on these moments, it allows them to pass, reinforcing how fleeting, unregulated emotion has become. What's most striking is how these symbols don't resolve, they persist. The film doesn't use imagery to guide us toward clarity, but to trap us inside a visual logic that mirrors the character's own limitations. Symbols don't point forward, they loop. Enclosure repeats. Light withdraws. Objects remain tools. This creates a symbolic system of stasis. The world is not decaying, it's stabilized around loss. At its core, 28 years later is not asking whether humanity can survive catastrophe. It assumes survival has already been achieved. The film's real question is far more unsettling. What do we become once survival stops being a choice and starts being a tradition? This is a story about values that outlive their usefulness, about emergency logic fossilized into moral law. And beneath every infected shadow and fortified wall lies the same philosophical tension: security versus humanity. The film positions safety as the highest social good, but it refuses to treat that prioritization as neutral. Safety here demands obedience, simplification, and moral compression. Complex questions are flattened into procedures. Ethical nuance becomes a liability. The thematic force of the film emerges from watching how reasonable this all feels, how easily fear can be rebranded as responsibility. The movie doesn't accuse its characters of cruelty. It indicts a system where cruelty no longer registers as cruelty at all. One of the central philosophical questions running through the narrative is whether morality can survive when context never changes. In crisis, moral compromise can feel temporary, an exception justified by urgency. But 28 years later explores what happens when urgency never ends, when the exception becomes the rule. The film suggests that ethics are not erased by catastrophe, they're reprogrammed. Killing, abandoning, excluding. These acts don't disappear. They are reframed as maintenance. Necessary evils become neutral tasks. And neutrality, the film argues, is more dangerous than malice. Another thematic tension lies between memory and inheritance. Those who remember the world before cling to an idea of humanity defined by what was lost. Those born after define humanity by what functions now. Neither perspective is fully sufficient. Memory risks becoming nostalgia, detached from feasibility. Inheritance risks becoming obedience detached from conscience. The film refuses to crown either side as correct. Instead, it stages their collision and asks the audience to sit inside the discomfort of irresolution. Progress, it implies, may require betrayal, of memory, of safety, or of both. Hope itself is treated with suspicion. In most post-apocalyptic narratives, hope is the moral North Star. Here, hope is unstable, dangerous, contagious in its own way. Hope motivates resistance, but it also invites risk, not just to individuals, but to entire communities built on controlled predictability. The film asks whether hope is a virtue if its cost is collective safety, and more disturbingly, whether a world that cannot tolerate hope deserves to continue unchanged. The film also interrogates collective good versus individual moral agency. Systems thrive by removing choice. Individuals thrive by exercising it. This creates an unsolvable tension. When characters act according to conscience, they threaten stability. When they submit to stability, they erode conscience. The film doesn't resolve this conflict. It deepens it. Every act of defiance saves something intangible, but endangers something measurable. Every act of compliance preserves life but corrodes meaning. The thematic power lies in refusing to tell us which loss is worse. Violence, too, is philosophically reframed. It is no longer emotional or explosive. It is procedural. That shift matters. The film suggests that violence committed without passion is more corrosive than violence committed in rage. Rage burns out. Procedure persists. When killing becomes a checkbox rather than a breakdown, the moral universe tilts quietly but permanently. The film's most haunting suggestion is that humanity doesn't disappear when people become monsters. It disappears when monsters become systems. Underlying all of this is a deeper existential question. Is adaptation always progress? The characters have adapted brilliantly. They have survived longer than anyone could have predicted. And yet, the film asks whether adaptation that demands the continuous shrinking of empathy is indistinguishable from extinction, just slower. The infected destroy bodies. The system risks destroying souls. That parallel is never stated outright, but it hums beneath every decision. What makes the film's thematic core resonate is its refusal to provide a clean philosophical answer. It doesn't argue that safety is wrong or that rebellion is right. Instead, it exposes the cost of absolutism in either direction. The tragedy is not that characters make the wrong choices, it's that the world has narrowed their options until every choice is wrong in a different way. Morality hasn't failed, it's been cornered. By the end of this movement, the film has transformed from a survival narrative into a moral thought experiment. It asks the audience not what they would do in this world, but what they already accept in their own. How many compromises feel reasonable because they're familiar? How many rules feel natural because they've always been there? The film's themes don't stay on screen. They leak outward, unsettling precisely because they don't require infected to exist. By the time 28 years later reaches its emotional midpoint, the film has already done something quietly radical. It has trained the audience to feel restraint as normal. Fear doesn't spike here, it hums. The emotional architecture is built not on release, but on containment. And that choice is deliberate. The film understands that in a world defined by long-term survival, emotion itself becomes a resource to ration. Music is the first manipulative tool the film withholds. Where traditional horror leans on score to guide fear, this film often denies it. Silence dominates moments that would typically beg for sonic escalation. The absence forces attention inward. Without musical permission to feel, the audience becomes hyper-aware of their own reactions. Anxiety doesn't arrive as a cue. It emerges as a byproduct of watching characters suppress their own responses. When music finally does appear, it's restrained and functional, almost administrative. It doesn't heighten emotion, it stabilizes it. That choice reinforces the film's worldview. Emotion is something to be controlled, not indulged. Editing rhythm plays a similar role. Cuts are efficient, rarely indulgent. The film avoids frantic pacing even in moments of danger. Instead, it opts for procedural calm. Actions unfold with unsettling clarity. This rhythm conditions the viewer to experience violence the way the characters do, not as shock, but as task. When something horrific happens, the lack of stylistic emphasis forces the audience to confront it without the protective buffer of spectacle. The discomfort lingers longer because nothing distracts from it. Performance is where the emotional manipulation becomes most precise. Actors rarely externalize feeling. Grief is held in jaw tension. Fear shows up as delayed reaction rather than panic. This restraint isn't emptiness, it's discipline learned over years. The film invites empathy not through tears, but through effort. We recognize the labor involved in not breaking down, and that recognition generates a quieter, deeper connection than overt emotional display ever could. Cinematography reinforces this control. The camera maintains distance even in intimate moments. Close-ups are rare and therefore potent. When the film does move closer, it feels invasive, as if we're seeing something we're not supposed to. This creates an emotional hierarchy. Interiority is protected. Exposure is dangerous. The audience is positioned not as confidant, but as observer. reinforcing the film's theme that vulnerability is a risk, not a default. The most unsettling emotional manipulation occurs when the film does allow release. These moments are brief, almost accidental. A laugh, a moment of warmth, a shared memory. They're not framed as triumphant, they're framed as fragile. The emotional spike is followed immediately by withdrawal. This pattern conditions the viewer to experience hope as fleeting and precarious. The film teaches us, emotionally, what the characters already know intellectually: don't get attached. Importantly, the film never cheats. It doesn't manufacture emotion where the narrative hasn't earned it. When it manipulates, it does so in service of coherence. The emotional experience aligns with the thematic argument. The audience feels constrained because the characters are constrained. The discomfort isn't imposed, it's shared. By the end of this segment, the viewer realizes they've been shaped. Their emotional responses have been narrowed, disciplined, conditioned, just like the people on screen. The film hasn't just told a story about control, it has enacted it. And with that realization comes a subtle unease. If a movie can train us to accept emotional scarcity in 2 hours, what does long-term crisis do over decades? The structure of 28 years later is deceptively simple, and that simplicity is the point. The narrative moves forward in a mostly linear fashion, but the emotional experience does not. Time advances, yet nothing feels resolved. This disconnect between chronology and closure becomes the film's structural argument. Progression does not guarantee improvement. Survival can move forward while meaning stands still. The film withholds traditional inciting urgency. There is no single catalytic event that starts the story in a conventional sense, because for these characters, the crisis began before they were conscious of it. This structural choice immediately destabilizes expectation. We're not watching a disruption of normal life. We're watching normal life itself. By refusing a clear before and after divide, the film suggests that catastrophe is not an event, but a condition. The story doesn't erupt, it persists. Information is revealed with deliberate restraint. Exposition arrives indirectly, through behavior, through assumption, through what characters don't bother to explain anymore. The audience is forced to catch up, mirroring the experience of living in a system where rules are inherited, not questioned. This narrative strategy creates alignment, not through sympathy, but through orientation. We learn the world the same way newcomers would, by observing consequences. Confusion is not a flaw here, it's a thematic tool. Pacing reinforces this worldview. The film avoids spikes and valleys in favor of sustained pressure. Moments that would traditionally function as climaxes arrive without fanfare, and moments that feel emotionally significant are often structurally understated. This flattening of narrative emphasis reflects a society where everything has already happened once, and repetition has dulled reaction. The story refuses to reward attention with spectacle, asking instead for endurance. Crucially, the plot operates on emotional logic rather than mechanical logic. Decisions are not always the most efficient or strategic, they are the most psychologically consistent. Characters act in accordance with belief, not optimal outcome. This occasionally frustrates conventional expectations, but it deepens coherence. Structure becomes an extension of character psychology. The midpoint does not function as a reversal so much as a clarification. Stakes don't escalate, they crystallize. The audience realizes that the story is not about preventing disaster, but about deciding which kind of disaster is acceptable. From that point forward, narrative momentum is driven less by external threat and more by internal contradiction. Each step forward tightens the moral space rather than expanding it. The final act resists closure aggressively. Questions remain unanswered. Consequences remain partially unseen. The film denies the audience the comfort of resolution, because resolution would imply that the system has been successfully challenged or reaffirmed. Instead, the ending leaves the world intact, but unsettled. That choice is not ambiguity for its own sake, it's philosophical consistency. A story about inherited trauma cannot end neatly without betraying its premise. What emerges is a narrative structure that mirrors the lived experience of long-term crisis, ongoing, exhausting, unresolved. The film doesn't build toward catharsis, it builds toward recognition. By the time it ends, the audience understands that the absence of narrative relief is the point. Survival stories don't end. They just change shape. By the time 28 years later turns its gaze outward, it becomes clear that this story isn't speculative, it's reflective. The film is deeply aware of the cultural moment it speaks to, and it doesn't disguise that awareness behind allegory. Instead, it lets parallels surface naturally. This is a narrative born from an era of prolonged crisis, where emergency measures stretch into years, where fear becomes policy, and where exhaustion quietly replaces outrage. The infected may be fictional, but the psychology surrounding them is not. The film emerges from a world shaped by pandemics, climate anxiety, political polarization, and institutional distrust. It understands how quickly language like temporary, for your safety, and necessary sacrifice can become permanent fixtures of daily life. 28 years later doesn't accuse these ideas of being false. It questions what happens when they are never retired. Culturally, the film taps into a shared fatigue, the sense that we are all living inside extended emergencies with no clear endpoint, adjusting expectations downward and calling it resilience. One of the film's sharpest cultural insights is its portrayal of compliance without coercion. No one is constantly forcing obedience. There are no omnipresent villains barking orders. Instead, people police themselves and each other. This reflects a modern anxiety that control no longer needs to be imposed violently if it can be internalized psychologically. The film mirrors how societies normalize surveillance, restriction, and exclusion when they are framed as communal responsibility. The most chilling element is how reasonable it all feels. Representation in the film reinforces this idea. Authority figures are not caricatures. They are tired, pragmatic, often sincere. The system is not run by monsters. It's maintained by people who believe they are doing their best under impossible conditions. That choice matters. It shifts the film's social commentary away from simple blame and toward systemic inertia. The danger isn't evil leadership. It's a structure that rewards emotional detachment and punishes moral friction. The generational divide depicted in the film resonates strongly with contemporary culture. Those who remember a freer world struggle to articulate what was lost without sounding naive. Those who never experienced it view such memories as liabilities rather than guidance. This mirrors real-world tensions between generations shaped by different baseline realities: economic, environmental, psychological. The film captures the quiet resentment on both sides, elders frustrated by acceptance, youth burdened by expectations they never agreed to inherit. The movie also engages with representation politics, subtly rather than performatively. Survival hierarchies exist, but they are not explicitly racialized or sensationalized. Instead, the film focuses on utility. Who is useful? Who is expendable? Who is protected by proximity to power? This reflects a broader cultural anxiety about how value is assigned in crisis. Lives are weighed not by inherent worth, but by function. The film doesn't need speeches to critique this logic, it simply shows its consequences. Ideologically, 28 years later resists both nihilism and optimism. It does not suggest that systems are irredeemable, nor does it pretend that individual heroism can dismantle them easily. This refusal to simplify places the film firmly in conversation with a generation skeptical of grand narratives. The worldview here is cautious, morally alert, and deeply suspicious of solutions that promise safety without cost. It aligns with a cultural mood that no longer believes in clean victories, only trade-offs. Genre plays a crucial role in this cultural commentary. By returning to a franchise rooted in rage and infection, the film uses familiar horror language to explore contemporary fears that are less visible but more pervasive. The monster has evolved. It's no longer just viral, it's ideological. Fear spreads not only through bites, but through habits, policies, and inherited assumptions. Horror becomes a lens, not for imagining the end of the world, but for recognizing the one we're already negotiating. Perhaps the most unsettling cultural reflection is how the film positions endurance as virtue. Characters are praised not for kindness or courage, but for adaptability and emotional control. This mirrors a society that often equates mental toughness with moral strength, even when that toughness requires emotional suppression. The film asks whether a culture that celebrates endurance above all else eventually forgets what endurance was meant to protect. 28 years later doesn't just extend a franchise. It enters into conversation with it, arguing quietly with the films that came before and the genre that shaped them. Where earlier entries were fueled by immediacy and eruption, this one is defined by sediment. Rage no longer explodes, it settles. That shift alone signals a generational evolution in horror storytelling, from panic to paralysis, from shock to normalization. The original 28 Days Later reimagined the zombie as speed, as uncontrollable emotional overflow. Rage was kinetic, external, terrifying because it was sudden. 28 weeks later expanded that fear into scale and militarized response, exposing how institutional panic could rival viral threat. 28 years later completes that trajectory by asking what happens after both fear and force lose their novelty. This film isn't about rage unleashed. It's about rage domesticated, managed, filed under policy. In genre terms, this places the film closer to slow-burn existential horror than traditional infection narratives. The threat is no longer, will they survive? But what have they become by surviving? This aligns it with films like Children of Men, where collapse is not explosive, but bureaucratic, and The Road, where survival strips life down to ethical residue. Yet 28 years later distinguishes itself by focusing not on scarcity of resources, but scarcity of moral imagination. The film also dialogues with contemporary horror's shift away from monster-centric fear towards systemic dread. Like It Comes at Night, or The Girl with All the Gifts, it treats mistrust, ideology, and inherited belief as more dangerous than any creature. But where those films still orbit moments of revelation, 28 years later resists epiphany. There is no unveiling of truth that sets things right. That resistance feels intentional, a response to an era no longer convinced that knowledge alone leads to change. Within the lineage of zombie cinema, the film's most radical move is its decentering of the infected. George A. Romero used zombies as satire, mirrors of consumerism, conformity, collapse. 28 years later pushes that metaphor further by almost removing the mirror entirely. The infected remain, but they are no longer the focus. The real reflection is turned inward, onto the living. This marks a maturation of the genre, suggesting that monsters were always placeholders for something more uncomfortable, ourselves adapting too well. The film also speaks to Danny Boyle's broader thematic obsessions, systems under strain, individuals negotiating morality inside chaos, but with a colder eye. Where earlier works pulsed with urgency and rebellion, this one feels weary, observational. It doesn't romanticize resistance. It doesn't glorify collapse. Instead, it studies endurance like a scientist might study erosion. That tonal evolution mirrors a cultural shift. Outrage has given way to fatigue, and cinema has followed. Comparatively, 28 years later rejects the redemption arcs common in post-apocalyptic storytelling. Films like Mad Max, Fury Road, or A Quiet Place still believe in moments of collective triumph, in action as purification. This film is more skeptical. It suggests that even victory, if it occurs, will be partial, compromised, and morally expensive. That skepticism places it firmly in conversation with modern audiences who no longer trust clean endings. Perhaps most importantly, the film advances the genre by reframing fear itself. Traditional horror thrives on escalation. This film thrives on stasis. It understands that the most terrifying prospect isn't sudden death. It's permanent diminishment. A world that continues functioning while forgetting why it mattered to function at all. In doing so, 28 years later doesn't just inherit a cinematic lineage, it alters its trajectory. When 28 years later ends, it doesn't do so with resolution. It ends with resonance. The film understands that its true impact won't be measured in answers provided, but in questions that refuse to leave. Long after the final image fades, What lingers is not fear of infection or curiosity about plot outcomes, but a quieter unease, the recognition that this world feels uncomfortably plausible, not because of its monsters, but because of its compromises. What stays with the viewer most powerfully is the emotional aftertaste of normalization. The film doesn't shock us into reflection. It dulls us into it. We realize retroactively how much we accepted while watching, how many moments we didn't question because they felt necessary. That realization mirrors the character's own moral drift, creating an unsettling alignment between audience and story. The film doesn't just depict erosion of values, it enacts it gently, patiently, until resistance feels exhausting. This is where the film's lasting power lies. 28 years later is not built for instant gratification or surface-level debate. It's built for delayed processing. It invites re-watching not to catch hidden clues, but to track when our own discomfort first softened into understanding. Each viewing becomes a mirror, reflecting how our interpretations change depending on what we're willing to justify at that moment in our own lives. Emotionally, the film offers no release, but it offers clarity. Not clarity of outcome, but clarity of cost. It makes plain that survival, when stripped of moral friction, becomes a hollow achievement. That idea doesn't announce itself loudly. It settles, slowly, like sediment, reshaping how we think about endurance, resilience, and what we praise as strength. The film quietly asks whether a life preserved at the expense of empathy is preservation at all, or simply delay. Critically, the film's ambition is undeniable. It reaches for something deeper than genre satisfaction, and for the most part, it earns that reach. Its restraint may frustrate viewers seeking momentum or payoff, and its refusal to resolve thematic tension may feel unsatisfying to those accustomed to narrative closure. But these are not failures of execution. They are expressions of intent. The film is not designed to comfort. It is designed to stay with you. If there is a limitation, it lies in how demanding the film is of its audience. This is not a passive experience. It requires patience, emotional attentiveness, and a willingness to sit with ambiguity. Some viewers may disengage where the film asks for endurance, but for those who stay, the reward is not entertainment, it's insight, and insight, here, comes with weight. Ultimately, 28 years later succeeds because it understands something essential about horror and about humanity. The most terrifying future isn't one where everything collapses. It's one where everything continues, just reduced. Where systems work, bodies survive, and something unnamed but vital quietly disappears. The film doesn't claim that this outcome is inevitable. It simply shows how easily it becomes acceptable. Who should watch this film? Not those seeking spectacle or easy catharsis. This is a film for viewers willing to interrogate their own thresholds, for compromise, for obedience, for emotional distance. It's for anyone who has lived through prolonged uncertainty and felt themselves adapting in ways that felt necessary but uneasy. It's for those who understand that the scariest question isn't, what if the world ends, but what if it doesn't, and this is what it becomes.